Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses, and this is Atlantis-fact or Fable by Manly P. Hall, an article taken from PRS Journal, Volume 18, Number 3, Winter 1958. Atlantis-fact or Fable by Manly P. Hall. The story of Atlantis has been of perennial interest since Plato first expounded the narrative brought from Egypt by Solon. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, 1st century BC, enlarged considerably upon the earlier account, declaring that the Amazons, a fabulous group of women warriors, occupied an area of Atlantis. He held that the Atlanteans and Amazons united their forces, conquering Egypt and Asia Minor, but were ultimately defeated by the culture hero Hercules. During those long centuries in which the Western Hemisphere was unknown to the men of the Dark Ages, it was assumed that a continent of some kind did exist west of the Pillars of Hercules, but ordinary mortals feared to explore this semi-divine region, regarded as the abode of superhuman creatures. After the voyages of Columbus, maps of the Atlantic area often included an Atlantic island in the general region of the Azores. The brilliant Jesuit priest Athanasius Kircher was one of the first to identify the Azores Islands as vestiges of the ancient Atlantic continent. In his Area Noae, Kircher published a map of the world according to a conjectural geography of the changes resulting from the deluge. This work appeared in 1665, and we reproduce Kircher's extraordinary map as indicative of the thinking of that time in his Mundus Subterraneus, 1678. Kircher also gives a map of Atlantis according to the description of Plato and the ideas of the ancient Egyptians. It is curious that in this representation the eastern and western hemispheres have been reversed, or perhaps the writing on the map has been inverted to the chart itself. This presents a typical example of the confusion of ancient mapmakers. From Kircher's Arcano, a conjectural geographical map of the world after the deluge, designed in 1675 by Kircher. In more recent times, Heinrich Schliemann, the rediscoverer of ancient Troy and an archaeologist of distinction, made a notable contribution to Atlantean research. Having made a fortune as a military contractor at the time of the Crimean War, he devoted his wealth to the excavation of ancient sites, and came to the conclusion that he had discovered substantial proof of the existence of Atlantis. Schliemann regarded such ancient monuments as Stonehenge in England and Karnak in Brittany as remnants of ancient Atlantean culture. He traveled considerably and discovered much supporting testimony in the artifacts and vestigial remains of early culture groups. One of the most interesting and dramatic personalities in the field of the Atlantis hypothesis was the Honorable Ignatius Donnelly, Member of Congress from Minnesota from 1863 to 1869. Mr. Donnelly had already served as Lieutenant Governor of Minnesota, and after his defeat in Congress in 1870, he retired to his rambling house in Neeninga to write a book. In 1882, this work was published by Harper's under the title Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. The book shows a tremendous amount of thoughtful research, and it has frequently been referred to as a production of genuine erudition. In both America and England, Donnelly's volume found immediate popularity. In a letter to the author, the English statesman Gladstone declared that he was disposed to believe in the existence of Atlantis. The subject was on everyone's tongue, and a considerable literature, much of it poetic, soon appeared. Harper's apparently do not have a record of the number of copies sold, but it is believed that Atlantis, the antediluvian world, passed through at least 50 editions or separate printings. Encouraged by the success of his book, Donnelly took the lecture platform for a time. His insatiable curiosity, however, led him into other fields, and he neglected Atlantis to become a powerful exponent of Lord Bacon in the Bacon-Shakespeare controversy. After Donnelly, we can mention the distinguished English scientist, Professor Lewis Spence. In his book, The Problem of Atlantis, Spence summarizes most of the older records bearing upon the Atlantis legend and extends his considerations into many byways, including Egyptian religion and Central American archaeology. Later, Professor Spence also examined the problem of Lemuria, investigating old legends relating to a submerged continent in the Pacific Ocean in the general region of the Australasian archipelago. From Kircher's Mundus Subterraneus, conjectural map of Atlantis according to the description given by Plato. It will be noted from the direction of the arrow that the entire map is inverted. Why Kircher did this is unknown. The July 1930 issue of Popular Mechanics magazine contains an article entitled "The Hunt for Lost Atlantis" by Leslie Aurier. The article was concerned with the resolution of Count Byron Kuhn de Prorock, a recognized archaeologist, to form an expedition in search of the lost Atlantis. He sought the assistance of French and American institutions and intended to make use of a diving cylinder developed by Dr. H. Hartmann. Dr. Hartmann's cylinder could withstand sufficient pressure to be useful at a depth of 2,500 feet. Mr. Aurier says that it was Count de Prorock's hope that he would be able to prove that Africa and South America were once connected by land. Coincident with the subterranean explorations, there was also to be a land expedition in the area of the Sahara Desert. The Count de Prorock stated, "The ancient history of the Mediterranean tells us of cities that have been submerged, galleys that have sunk, and other treasures beneath the sea. And the legend of the lost continent is still the subject of endless controversy. I long have thrilled at the thought that the legend of Atlantis might be an existing fact of a submerged continent between the Americas and Africa, where ruins of a lost civilization may still be found, with temples and houses covered with the sea growth of ages to be explored and excavated by the new diving apparatus of modern invention." Vice President Charles G. Dawes, later American ambassador to the Court of St. James, is best remembered for his underslung pipe and his efforts to modernize English protocol. During the era of de Prorock and others, the Honorable Mr. Dawes became so interested in the Atlantis idea that it was reported in the press that he financed a search in the Vatican Library in hopes of discovering among the musty old documents some key to the enigma. The investigation, which was being carried on by a Yale scholar, was particularly concerned with the Mayan dialect and the attempt to decipher the inscriptions in Yucatan and Guatemala, which have so long baffled archaeologists. The ex-vice president entertained the hope that if these ancient glyphs could be correctly read, they might settle forever the Atlantis problem. It is possible that Ambassador Dawes had read Baldwin's Ancient America. If so, his interest in the subject was a good example of a trend in scholarship which marked the opening years of the 19th century and was distinctly Atlantis conscious. In 1912, Monsieur Pierre Termier, a member of the Academy of Science and Director of Service of the Geologic Chart of France, delivered a most eloquent lecture on Atlantis before the Institut Oceanographique. Later, this lecture was translated and published in the annual report of the Board of Regents of the Smithsonian Institution for the year ending June 30th, 1915. According to the valiant French savant, it seems more and more evident that a vast region, continental or made up of great islands, has collapsed west of the Pillars of Hercules. Monsieur Termier's reasons were purely geological and have been well substantiated by subsequent findings. Theopompos and Marcellus, ancient historians, refer to both a continent and islands in the Atlantic Ocean. Marcellus wrote of 7 small islands and 3 great ones, which together constituted the Atlantides. The pioneer Americanist, Dr. Augustus Le Plongeon, claimed to have decoded the Codex Troano, an early writing of the Mayas of Yucatan, the original manuscript of which is in Madrid. Le Plongeon declared that according to this codex, the land of mud was destroyed in the year 6 Khan on the 11th Mulak, in the month Zak. Whether this figure can be reconciled with the date of the Atlantean destruction as preserved by Plato is a matter which only time can determine. But when, according to Le Plongeon, the Troano manuscript declares that the land of mud was sacrificed, that 10 countries were torn asunder and scattered and finally sank, carrying their 64 million inhabitants with them, it should be remembered that the idea of 10 countries coincides exactly with the number of islands described by Marcellus and the 10 kingdoms given by Plato. From Donnelly's Atlantis. Probable location of Atlantis with its connecting ridges from deep-sea soundings. John Johnston, ESQ, in Archaeologia Americana, writes that the Shawnaus and Algonquin tribe have a tradition that their ancestors reached America by crossing the sea, For centuries, these people preserved an annual ceremony in celebration of a deliverance, but it is no longer possible to determine the nature of the evil which they providentially escaped. The catastrophe must have been of considerable import to have become the subject of such perpetuation. Schoolcraft, in the Indian tribes of the United States, writing of the North American Indians as a group, says, "They relate generally that there was a deluge at an ancient epoch, which covered the earth and drowned mankind except a limited number." Schoolcraft preserved at least fragments of the famous speech delivered to Cortés, the Spanish conqueror, by Montezuma, the Mexican king. I would have you understand, before you begin your discourse, that we are not ignorant or stand in need of your persuasions to believe that the great prince you obey is descended from our ancient Quetzalcoatl, lord of the 7 caves of the Navatlaques, and lawful king of those 7 nations which gave beginning to our Mexican empire. Referring to Montezuma's speech, Schoolcraft notes that the mention of Quetzalcoatl as the lord of the 7 caves probably implied that he was the lawful chief of 7 tribes, bands, or nations. This thinking encouraged the learned Americanist, the Abbé Brasseur de Bourbourg, to defend the Atlantis hypothesis with extensive references to the beliefs and legends of the Central American Indians. Among the Portuguese, there are also legends of a mysterious island to the west, called by them Isla das Sete Cidades, the island of the 7 cities, or Antilla. Are these 7 cities the 7 golden cities of Cibola for which the Spaniards searched in their conquest of Lower California? Are these also the original 7 cities ruled over by the feathered serpents or winged seraphs? The thought of the serpents is not so far-fetched when we remember that the Arab geographers always referred to Antilla or Atlantis as the Dragon's Isle. Both Homer and Horace seem to have been concerned with mysterious worlds, abodes of the blessed far beyond the reach of ordinary mortals. We can understand then why Atlantis came to be associated with the Elysian Fields or the abode of the blessed, and has been identified by some with the Welsh Avalon. The Atlantides, or 7 islands, are described by early mythologists as the 7 Pleiades, daughters of Atlas, which were lifted out of the depths of the earth upon the shoulders of their giant father. Louis Paccoliot, a French writer on obscure subjects in his Histoire des Vierges, notes, "A religious belief to Malacca and Polynesia, that is to say to the 2 opposite extremes of the oceanic world, affirms that all these islands once formed 2 immense countries inhabited by yellow men and black men, always at war, and that the gods, wearied with their quarrels, having charged ocean to pacify them, the latter swallowed up the 2 continents, and since then it has been impossible to make him give up his captives." Diodorus, after relating the story of the island kingdom, very much after the manner of Plato, enlarges the account by stating that it was discovered by Phoenician navigators who, while sailing along the west coast of Africa, were driven across the ocean by violent winds. These navigators, upon returning, brought such wonderful accounts of the wealth and beauty of the mysterious island that the Tyrrhenians planned to colonize the region, but were delayed by the opposition of the Carthaginians. Diodorus does not mention the country by name, but he implies that it still existed at his time. The historian Pausanias, 2nd century AD, also describes a voyage to the outer sea where the storm-swept voyagers came to islands inhabited by wild men with tails. The account given by Theopompos was of Phrygian origin and is preserved to us by Aelian. This account is also mentioned by Stambo, and the mysterious continent or island was called Europis. Proclus, the Neoplatonist, says that Crantor, the first commentator on Plato, accepted the Atlantis story as historical and therefore was ridiculed by his contemporaries. This must mean that the knowledge of that time was not much greater than our own. It is important, however, that the prevailing belief of a continent or island west of Europe had a profound effect on the thinking of the 15th century, and it is said that a passage by Seneca describing a land in the far region of the west strongly influenced Columbus. We have already noted that in the early accounts, Atlas was an ancient Atlantean king. It is interesting, therefore, that this name should be applied to the great chain of mountains in the northwest part of Africa. In this regard, we may have recourse to certain ideas resident in the writings of Alexander von Humboldt? Is it possible that reference to ancient voyages could refer not to lands in the extreme Occident, but only to distant regions of Europe and Africa, then far to the west of the center of classical culture? If, for example, early navigators passed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Straits of Gibraltar, they might well have traveled in a somewhat southerly direction and reached the extreme west coast of Africa. This might explain the men with tails mentioned by Pausanias. Plato's account does not seem to imply that the Atlantic continent was a great distance from Europe. He further allotted that part of Atlantis nearest to Europe to Gadeirus, the twin brother of Atlas and hero eponymous of the city of Gades. This Gades, now Cadiz, is an important seaport of southwest Spain, on the Bay of Cadiz. While this speculation could be extended to imply that the Mediterranean countries were overrun at a remote time by primitive tribes from the western extremities of Europe and North Africa, we advance this concept merely because it has been given some consideration. Leo Frobenius, in his The Voice of Africa, ties his entire analysis of the origins of African culture to a peculiar phase of the Atlantis hypothesis. He points out that beneath the surface of African culture there is a strong surviving tradition of a powerful prehistoric civilization which declined long ago. The religious beliefs of the people, their arts, legends, symbols, rituals, and architecture all indicate that at some remote period the Dark Continent had direct contact with some advanced social group. Frobenius gives special thought to the area involving Ife, northern Yoruba, and Great Benin. Referring to the Yoruban civilization, Frobenius writes that it must be declared essentially African. By this I mean to say that it not only rests upon the surface of African soil like a bubble blown from abroad which a breath can also dispel, but rather that it is actually incorporated with it. We are then faced with the question whether it was here developed or transplanted hither, that is, whether we are to regard it as autogenetic or in symphonic relation to foreign civilizations. The question is, did it originate in this country itself, or if it was brought from beyond, which was the road that it took? The same author then points out that many of the basic concepts of the Yorubans find their counterparts among the ancient Etruscans. The culture is pre-Christian, but points to a solid attainment which became both a traditional and a biological inheritance. Frobenius then attempts to identify the mysterious people of the West with the Tertia fleet, which passed eastward through the Pillars of Hercules in the 13th century BC. If rather dramatically, Frobenius summarizes his concepts thus, and this is the method by which I maintain I have rediscovered Atlantis, the emporium of the culture of the West, on the further side of the Straits of Gibraltar. That Atlantis, whose walls, as Solon informs us, held within them Poseidon's castle, where there was a wealth of luxuriant vegetation, where tree-like plants grew which gave forth food and drink and unguents, oil palm. That a fruit tree, with quickly decaying fruit banana and desirable condiments pepper, there flourished abundantly. That elephants lived there. That bronze or brass was won there, as till recently was so behind the Yoruban mountain range. That the natives wore dark blue, tree indigo garments, and that they had a somewhat foreign style of architecture, ridge roofs of palm leaves. Frobenius, realizing that there are many phases of the Atlantis legend which cannot be entirely explained by his interpretation, instinctively seeks safer ground. He points out that West Africa constitutes a natural region from which navigators might attempt a trip to the Western Hemisphere. Also, it is quite possible that West Africa and parts of Western Spain and Portugal could be surviving remnants of the Atlantic continent, or a place of refuge which could be reached by the survivors of the destruction of Atlantis. Frobenius is aware that there are strong parallels between the cultural customs and symbols of West Africa and the Aztec-Toltec-Maya complex of peoples on the American continent. Speculation as to whether it would be possible to navigate far enough to reach America from Europe or North Africa several thousand years ago cannot be conclusive. Storms and unusual circumstances might have permitted a stray voyager to accomplish this long and perilous journey. There are still in the Polynesian islands huge canoes with a cruising radius of over 1,000 miles. Much would depend upon the cooperation of natural factors. If Atlantis was to the west of continental Europe, Atlantean culture might have moved through North Africa before it reached the eastern Mediterranean. We also know that Egyptian culture moved southward and penetrated into the central parts of the continent, strongly marking tribal customs, as pointed out by Sir A. E. Wallace Budge in his work Osiris and the Egyptian Resurrection. Up to this time, we have been dealing largely with that type of evidence which originates in human records and remains. There is, however, an entirely different approach, and to introduce this, I would like to mention the supplementary bulletin on ancient continents issued by the United States Department of the Interior, Office of Education, Washington, D.C., relating to a broadcast given January 26, 1937 over NBC on the subject, "Did Atlantis Exist?" It is interesting to note that this bulletin, which consists of 3 pages of single-space typing, in no way questions the possibility or reasonableness of the Atlantis hypothesis. It even mentions Donnelly's book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. On the front page of the bulletin, Atlantis is indicated as occupying the greater part of the Atlantic Ocean area. On the eastern side, it extends downward from southern England to the westernmost point of Africa. On the western side, it extends southward from approximately Cape Hatteras to Cuba. The area involved would be considerably larger than the United States. This bulletin gathers the case for Atlantis under 4 headings. 1. Such a catastrophe as the sinking of Atlantis was possible. 2. The floor of the Atlantic once stood at a much higher level than at present. 3. There is a ridge between 6,000 and 8,000 feet high running through the Atlantic Ocean. 4. Similar or identical species of plants and animals exist on continents separated by oceans. These 4 points are individually considered with scientific verification from facts already established. A paragraph in connection with the 3rd point will indicate the general attitude. Deep-sea soundings have revealed a great elevation or ridge which rises about 8,000 feet above the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, and it reaches the surface of the ocean in the Azores and other islands. This ridge must have been above the water once upon a time because the mountains and valleys of its surface could never have been produced except by agencies acting above the water. It is covered with volcanic ash, traces of which are found right across the ocean to the American coast. The bulletin goes on to emphasize flora and fauna common to the eastern and western hemispheres, which could not have been so distributed, had there not at one time been land bridges. The bulletin points out that cotton probably originated in America and was transported to the Old World at a very early time. The banana also is found throughout tropical Asia and Africa and was cultivated in America before 1492. As it possesses no easily transportable bulbs and cannot be propagated by cutting or by seed, it could only have traveled by prehistoric human care or by land bridges. The more the situation is examined, the more reasonable it becomes to assume the existence of an ancient continent between America and Europe. While studying various natural testimonies, we should not forget the migrations of religions and of the essential spiritual convictions which underlie the rise of cultures. There is an ancient myth, almost universally distributed, of a race of heroes or of divine beings who were the primordial teachers of mankind. In most cases, these teachers were associated with the sea. They came out of oceans, remained with mortals for a time, and then returned to their watery abode. In China, the imperial family descended from Fua He, who was born from a fish's mouth and bestowed the knowledge of writing and the trigrams. In India, the first incarnation or avatar of Vishnu represents this deity rising from the mouth of a fish, or with the lower part of his body in the form of a fish. It was this fish that guided the ark of the Hindu Noah safely through the universal deluge. The peoples in the valley of the Euphrates traced their culture to Oan or Dagon, the man with the body of a fish, who came out of the sea to instruct them and to bestow upon them the advantages of civilization. In Mexico, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, came from the sea on a raft of serpents and stepped ashore near the site of the present city of Veracruz. This Quetzalcoatl was a sage and a prophet, and he established the laws which were later to guide the Indian nations. In this case, the seamen came from the east, which would be geographically consistent with the concept we wish to advance. These men from the sea always brought knowledge to a primitive or savage group, and as a result of this contact, a civilization arose where it had not previously existed. If we wish to assume that these seamen with their clothing of fish scales were colonizers, navigators, or military expeditions sent out from Atlantis, we would have a simple and reasonable explanation for many legends about the beginnings of cultural motions. The Irish have records of wise men who came out of the sea to the west coast of Ireland, and the Druids were also aware of saintly beings abiding in a semi-divine western land. The original migrations coincide with another important cycle of legends, relating to the Golden Age, which existed before men departed from the ways of the gods. The Golden Age might well be a largely forgotten remnant of an ancient historical fact, namely, that there existed a highly advanced civilization long before the rise of cultures which have survived to the present time. The destruction of Atlantis would explain why the hero gods who came out of the sea returned to their own land and never came back to the colonies they had established. With the destruction of the homeland, these colonies were left to their own devices. In many instances, they deteriorated, lapsing back into savagery, but not completely forgetting all phases of their ancient learning. Something of an ancient glory survived, and for this reason, behind even the most humble peoples, there is the shadowy record of a glorious past. In the beginning, the gods walked with men. Were these gods the brilliant princes of Atlantis who vanished away and survive only in mythology? Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.